Okay, we're live. We're recording. Awesome. So, Kate, you are our first guest on the Modern Mantra podcast, and it is an honor to have you on here, an honor to be in this container with you and to have this conversation with you. And to give everyone some context, Kate is a dear friend of mine and a dear collaborator of mine. And she is the co-founder and CEO of what I think is one of the coolest companies that I've come across for several reasons that we'll get into during this podcast. And I had the good fortune to be able to work with Rethinc for some time and deepen this connection with Kate and meet the team and really get deep into the work that they're doing. And I'm excited to have this conversation and share that with all of you that are listening. And so with that, I would love to just dive right in and say, hey, Kate, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Elijah. Thank you for having me.
And where I would love to start this is, I know that you've done a lot of work over a lot of years revolving around this notion of equity and equity in spaces of education, and now transitioning that equity work into spaces of work, professional workspaces. And particularly racial equity has been a focus over these years. And so one curiosity for me is what got you started on this path of service, right? Because to me, it's very abundantly clear that you're walking this path of service and the work that you're doing is much bigger than yourself. And I see that the work that you're doing as multi-generational work and as necessary work. And for me, my curiosity is what inspired you, what life experiences underpin that, or what was that catalyzing point to bring you into what I see as a clear path of service?
Yeah, that's an important question for each of us, right? Because why we think we're here defines how we behave here. And so the path for me is really one of breaking intergenerational curses or trauma, or however people want to say. This idea of coming up through intergenerational trauma and deciding that it's going to end with you. So I grew up with a lot of physical and sexual violence and all throughout my life, and had absolutely no meaning to make for that. So it was very compartmentalized, very sort of in survival mode in my late adolescence. And when I got to college, I somehow stumbled into like feminist thought and cultural studies, and probably most importantly, post-colonial studies, and then the fiction writing and poetry writing of Black women, of women of the African diaspora, centrally African American writers who were women, and really came to understand immediately, sort of finally and all at once, that any suffering I had experienced was part of what Bell Hooks calls white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, right? So like a much larger construct of suffering and oppression, in which the violence of white men on white women within their own families is a very small piece of a much bigger puzzle. And as I sort of quickly came to understand the role of that construct, of that hierarchy of power that crosses and relies on lines of difference, particularly race and gender, but particularly race, I really came to understand that there's just a larger thing to deconstruct here. There's a larger thing to take apart here. If humanity is to heal and to be grounded in love and grounded in wholeness, then there's a whole bunch of work to do. There's a whole bunch of undoing to do. And just immediately wanted to have my life be about that. And so in early days, I thought I would be a scholar. And that seemed very quickly dumb, because, I mean, not to disparage any scholars, because we need scholarship. And we need people who are sort of naming new things, learning new things, and writing them down, right? But I knew very quickly that I wanted to be in a place where violence, poverty, race, money, industry were all intersecting. And it seemed to me, and perhaps it's because I came up as a child of teachers, 4 teachers, 2 parents and 2 step parents. It seemed to me that the place to do that was school. So I just wanted to be a teacher. Then suddenly, like I hadn't, and I was going to go do things my parents hadn't done, but then I was like, no, that's where I should just go do this. So I got a job as a teacher. I got certified and got a job as a teacher in Indianapolis, Indiana, and just started working there. I can say more about that, but I think the sort of relevant pieces of that time are grounded in me being a white woman in a classroom of entirely Black students in Indianapolis, and believing that because I had been liberated by text, my purpose there was to liberate students through text. And I went about doing that by like whitesplaining Du Bois and Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, even Leslie Marmon Silko or Joy Harjo to students of color, which is just an insane idea. But students living in poverty, students of color in large urban centers, really most places in this country, but in large urban centers, have arrived in high school so unprepared for the grades in which they find themselves, so unprepared for the level of scholarship that would be required if they were going to be truly actually on their way to college and not just onto graduation stage. And I knew nothing about that. I knew nothing about how to make text accessible. I knew nothing about sort of barely functional literacy. I knew nothing about the distance between and the compounded deficit students were walking around with. And so I just explained it to them rather than try to understand that problem. So that was sort of my first insight into how one can be about service and still be like really part of the problem.
One thing I want to put a pin in there is what is whitesplaining? And then I would love to track back to your journey, but I just wanted to put a pin in that and get a better understanding of what you mean by that for folks.
Yeah, it just when white people explain suffering and oppression, or even Black thought in particular, to Black people, it's inappropriate, right? So like a far more helpful thing would be to support the capacity building, support the skill building, support the sort of practice and ability of young people, possibly by helping with fluency, possibly by even helping with phonics, because there are certainly kids who have arrived in high school who can't decode, right? But so helping with all of that and then providing the space, the material, the psychologically safe space to not understand, the psychologically safe space to sort of figure out and think, but to create an environment in which students are making meaning of this information and of their own ancestors for themselves, with me facilitating that process, but not, pouring my version of that content into their empty minds, right?
Totally.
Arrogant, really arrogant.
Got it. And then now tracking that back to, I guess, our identities and your identity and this phrase that you mentioned, lines of difference. And from my personal experience and knowing your personal experience, these lines of difference play a role and they have implications in our lives by default, given the nature of the world that we're born into, me as a Black man and you as a white woman. And what has always been so fascinating to me, I've never seen a white woman talk about race and as openly and as vulnerably and as radically transparent as you. And I know that over the last couple of decades, a lot of your work has been around racial equity. And I'm curious from your standpoint and from where you stand as a white woman, how do you understand, and knowing that these lines of difference each come with some level of privilege or oppression historically, how do you understand the difference in privilege between gender and race? And I guess what I'm getting at there is as a white woman, it seems like there has been a decent amount of emphasis on racial equity. And I'm curious how you navigate that, like the difference between those two pieces of your identity.
So I majored in women's studies in college, right? So like I really got pulled into feminist theory and, predominantly white feminist sort of thought and history making and activism. And as I said, as I was coming to understand this like bigger picture, while I was sort of schooled in that thought and very fluent in it, it became, there are a very small number of people in the campus I was on who had any awareness about the sort of shallow and sort of white monolithic feminism that sort of they had built and were teaching, so there I had several mentors and professors who sort of pulled me into another perspective about this, wherein yes, white women suffer from the patriarchy, which is wild and persistent, but the amount of privilege that comes with white skin is just so profound and so persistent. We're so safe. We're so protected. We're so able to access and do anything we want and say anything, and just without recourse. And so, and I think probably to my mind, in a place where, working in education and now in the world of work, where intellectual prowess and intellectual capacity is such a tool of power, and a presumption of what I'm capable of intellectually is such a decider on whether or not I will gain in access and power and credibility. And knowing that one of the key ways race works in America is around a presumption of, intellectual inferiority in Black and brown people, right? Rooted in sort of the cause, like protecting the cause of slavery, making sense of this idea of enslaving other humans. Like there's got to be some justification for that. And you can see it in the writings of Jefferson or Lincoln. You can see it in the laws. You can see it in the discourse of the time. You can see how the country is sort of built around this idea of intellectual inferiority in entire swaths of people, which is why to this day we have a tolerance for what people call the achievement gap, as if it can be explained by the general lower capacity of an entire group of people in this country. And so, the way race works is just so much more powerful, so much more violent, and so much more debilitating than the way gender works in this country. In fact, I mean, this will probably get me thrown off your podcast or at least somebody's radio, but the Me Too movement for this reason made me insane. Right. And so, because, I mean, yes, I understand that like the roots of it are grounded in the movement and action and protection of women of color. But what white women did with Me Too was so unbelievably awful. And what I mean by that in particular, not confronting sexual violence, not confronting sexual harassment even, but to use one's personal story of sexual violence or sexual oppression or gender-based oppression to center oneself and one's narrative and vilify and probably destroy, if possible, one's oppressor. After having said and continuing to say absolutely nothing ever about racial violence, racial oppression, or racialized suffering, nothing. Women who like wanted the conversation to be about them and their suffering overnight and wanted an entire movement to just take down swaths of men without ever taking any responsibility for their own role in the oppression of others, or even noticing or naming with their own power and their newfound voices the oppression of people of color in this country. So that, that to me is like one of the loudest examples of the problematics of white women in the US, which isn't to say I agree completely with what Robin DiAngelo would say, which is that we're fragile and this is why. We're not fragile. We're afraid. We're arrogant. We're self-centered. We're used to being in the middle of it all. We're not fragile. So I have more to say about that, but just to kind of, I'm not trying to bash and disparage white women. I'm trying to say, ladies, come on. We have much
Mm.
better than this in us.
Mm. Thank you for the share, and that definitely gives a deep understanding of where you're coming from in that regard. Because I've been in some rethink sessions, or have heard of some rethink sessions in which the focus is around anti-racism, and people will bring to the table, well, why aren't we focusing on this, or why aren't we focusing on that? And I feel like this is probably a great segue to talk about Rethink and talk about the incredible work that the organization is doing. And so I would just love to start by hearing from your perspective what Rethink is. How would you describe it? And along with that, I think it would also be good to get an understanding of the core problem or challenge that you think it's solving for.
Yeah. So it's impossible to answer this question without saying that this is not the first time I've led an organization. And in the past, as a leader, a lot of the sort of arrogance and centering that I'm talking about, it was part of my own path, part of my own journey. And in more ways than one, I sort of had my ass handed to me about it, right? So like I'm leading social justice work, and it is entirely possible to do so and believe that you have paid at the office. Entirely possible to believe that like you yourself are therefore pure in some way, as if wokeness is a thing one can arrive at and thank you very much, I've accomplished, I'll move on. Right. So awakening rather is this lifelong journey. And so because I was resisting further growth, further development, further awareness, I wasn't listening to the folks around me, and I wasn't listening to the voices of women of color around me. I had no idea the ways in which their suffering was not being attended to within our organization, or even where my own behavior was contributing to it. And so had a very powerful and very painful transition as a result of those mistakes, and just as a result of culture that was just not that healthy. The culture that I was leading was just not that healthy, right? And so I ended up on my knees, really reckoning with what that meant about me, and what that meant about the work, and what that meant about what the hell I was supposed to do with my life, if in fact there was going to be one. And during that searching time, during that journey time, I met a woman named Gina Breedlove, who would end up becoming one of the co-founders of Rethink and my partner. And Gina is a medicine woman in a Congolese tradition. And at a time when I really thought that I had no more role to play, she just thought that was absurd and funny even, right? She was like, yeah, no, you're supposed to work through this. You're supposed to feel this, sort through this, get to the other side of it. And then you and I are going to be sitting at a table advancing this work even farther, right? And she could see that. She could see it immediately because of the synchronicity in the sort of the way she and I approached life, and sort of are called by the spirit world, and all of the impact we believe we know we can have and have had and ought to continue to have together and in conjunction. And so about a year passed after she said that, and it all just started to become clear. It all just started to reveal itself. And we both started to gather people who we knew could play a role in this. And over time, we assembled probably 6 people in the end who co-founded this organization with this idea that none of us are above error. None of us are above the pull of racist ideas. None of us, regardless of racial identity, are bigger than this or done learning with this. And it turned out that each of us was sort of a person of faith in very, very different traditions, but that each of us had come to understand that our relationship with our God, or our relationship with our source, was the thing that would humanize us above all, and the thing that would give us courage to walk through pain, and courage to walk through other people's pain, right? To walk through other people's defensiveness and other people's resistance, and the obstacles and the barriers, everyone, all of us throw up, right? But would give us the strength to say, organization by organization, we know that racism manifests anywhere in the country, but work is a great place to see it play out, right? Work is a great place to watch racialized oppression and just oppression across lines of difference, hegemony win, right? White maleness win. And so work is a great place to find people, to ask people to be still and focus on this thing, right? And so as we were deciding we wanted to do that, there was this unbelievable moment, and this is about the time I met you, wherein because of COVID, half the people, or more than a third of the people in the country, left their job in a single year, right? And so I think you and I were talking, it was like October of 21, and I was like 4.5 million people left their job last month, right? And so we started to see this moment where the kids were deciding, right? I call them the youngs, right? The youngs were deciding. And by youngs, I mean like most millennials, all Zs, and even some of my own olds, a lot of us were just sort of like, no, I'm not happy here. I have to go. And then we started to see the research about why people were leaving. And it was feeling disrespected at work. It was like long-term job dissatisfaction, a lack of a feeling of equity at work. And I remember sitting with you and talking about like just watching these numbers, just like people just walking across like the screen of your imagination and just deciding that it's over now and work has to be better now. And so it just emerged as this opportunity to like, no, we have a business case. Finally, we have an actual business case for making work a better place to be vis-a-vis power, oppression, and difference. And there's actually almost, not totally, but almost appetite to solve this problem because it's costing people so much money in time and talent and productivity to just have an entire labor force say, nah, no. Right. And so like we all came up and, I'm 50 years old or 51 now. And we all came up in this culture wherein each of us is an island. Anyone who's not like me or doesn't work as hard or as well as me is an idiot. My proximity to power is the main sort of force of attraction in my life. And as I become more powerful and older, I become more and more, it's more allowable for me to be my actual self. It's more allowable for me to get what I need, get my needs met, vis-a-vis some kind of work-life balance or whatever I decide matters. I get to have it the older and more powerful I get. I had to sort of forgo my own humanness, my own dignity when I was young. And therefore, that is the journey for any of my underlings as they rise, right? And so like they have to tolerate that if they want to work here and they want to be like me someday. And that contract that none of us ever signed, but all of us were in, just broke in the middle of the pandemic. And it just became this moment where all the olds who had bet on this as being our time to be in power and to be ourselves and to have our needs met, were suddenly told by anyone who worked for us that, no, actually, this is not that time. This is the time where we set the whole thing right. So it's a very exciting moment. And we are excited to help the olds make that transition, right? And to sort of de-escalate some of the weaponization of the Me Too's of the world, of the sort of the ideas of anti-racism that have been weaponized, that have been targeted, the idea of sort of weaponizing white supremacy culture against people in power, right? Like sort of taking down a lot of the sort of vilification and divide and blame that has risen up as part of this thing has started to collapse, right? And so to help people reground in each other's humanity, reground in the idea that everybody gets to keep their dignity, reground in this idea that what if we all stay here and decide how we want to live and how we want to work together against a mission that we have that the organization has articulated, that a company has articulated, but to greet that mission with love, actual humanity, actual relationship and trust. A lot of folks my age are sort of real stressed out by this idea because it like the loss of productivity that seems inevitable. feels intolerable. But what we're seeing is that the more people lean into actually living this way, the youngs are not wrong. Like, their idea of how it could be these are ideas we had too once. So we can live this way, and we can help organizations move into being this way. And that's the work we're doing.
Right. And this really taps into the essence of the name, rethink. And what I heard there is reground. And then when we're in that grounded space, that's the space to actually rethink these systems that we have accepted as truth.
Yes.
That are merely ideas out of people's heads that are from a particular demographic and had a fraction of the information that we have today. Mm-hmm. And I myself, as a millennial, I had a similar experience with oppressive workspaces. I remember the first job that I got out of college, I put on a suit for my first day. It was my first day going to work after college, graduated, was working in private equity, put on a suit, was walking out of my door in East Harlem. I was living with my boy Malcolm and my other friend Addie, and I was walking out the door, and Malcolm just looks at me and starts laughing, and he's like, I'm like, why are you laughing? He's like, it just doesn't look like you. I'm like, it doesn't feel like me either, but like, let's see how it goes. Suits are not comfortable. It's not comfortable clothing, just a formality. And then I went to that job. I worked there for 6 months. And I remember I had a conversation with my manager, and I told him, I was like, I just don't think I'm really having fun here. Like it feels a little tedious. It feels a little mundane. Like I'm, yeah.
Who told you this would be fun?
That's spot on what he kind of said. He was like, it's called work for a reason. It's not supposed to be fun, And like, for me, something switched in that moment where I was like, I don't know if I necessarily subscribe to that philosophy, that I'm supposed to come here, contribute my time, my energy, my resources for X amount of time per day, and and wear uncomfortable clothes, and you're telling me it's not supposed to be fun. Something does not add up here, right? And so we're operating under these oppressive ways of working that are oppressive in some very overt ways and very subtle ways. And that kind of got me started on this path of looking into how this came to be. How did we end up with this sort of work culture? How did we end up with these work norms?
Right.
And what you're naming is that we have such a marriage and such a framework that is just simply driving towards productivity and really looking at humans as just resources to be monetized on, human resources, essentially. And how we, and these are just ideas out of people's heads from hundreds of years ago. This is just an extension of the Industrial Revolution, and in a lot of ways, an extension of so many other things that have come before that. And one thing I just want to acknowledge here, based on your share, is, Rethinc is the first company that I've encountered that is very intentionally and deliberately guided by spirit in so many ways. It's the first organization that I've stepped into, and I was like, this is a divine container. This is a divinely led organization. And this space that's held between the founding team is very sacred. And there's this very unique balance between being led by spirit and also working within the operational frameworks of how to grow and scale businesses. And so striking that balance has just been incredibly fascinating to witness. And for people that are listening, from me witnessing and taking part in the work that Rethinc does, it's the closest thing that I've ever seen to a sacred ceremony taking place inside of a workspace. Right? When I've been part of the work with Rethinc, it's the first time that I've seen a group of people that are not yoga teachers walk into a workspace and actually hold sacred space and sacred containers and kick off with guided meditations and sound healing and put people in a space where they can show up truthfully and show up openly and show up vulnerably. And that is such powerful work. And for the work that y'all are doing, it's like the workspace is this container, it's this entryway, but I see it's ceremonial, you know,
Yes.
and even me being able to go through the feedback that people are giving, it's, you know, some of the feedback is similar to feedback that I've heard in sharing circles after sitting with different plant medicines or different ceremonies. And so just witnessing the impact that y'all are having on people as individuals is really, really inspiring. So thank you for your share. Thank you for your work. And one thing I want to highlight about Rethink is the current transition and state that it finds itself in as an organization. And when I first met Kate and met Rethink, it was primarily a services organization that is working with different companies, different founders, providing coaching, providing training, providing workshops, providing strategy, and really going in and being those partners around how do we honor people in the workspace? How do we honor the people that are here? And how do we honor these lines of difference? And how do we make space for it all? And now what's happening is you are leading this charge in bringing a product into the world, actually developing a tech product, a digital product. So going from services organization to a product organization. And I know that that's a process. That's not an overnight thing. That's a long process. And so I just want to speak to that a little bit. And I'm curious to know what some of the challenges you've faced along this journey are. And along with that, if you're able to speak to some of the learnings, I feel like that would be great as well. I feel like challenges and learnings go hand in hand. But just as you move into this space, also knowing that you've held lots of leadership roles before, you've held the CEO title before, but this is the first time with this sort of model of transitioning from services into digital product for profit, leading a team in that. So just want to open the space and see what you felt or experienced in terms of challenges and learnings along this journey.
Yeah, sure. So one of the central challenges is that when we did pre-seed fundraising, we did a very small amount of it and decided that we would just kind of roll with the first tranche of investment that we got and use services for the rest of the product development funding, which is a fine idea. But having grown up in nonprofit with much larger budgets than the ones we were starting with, it was an arrogant and an ignorant idea to decide that we were going to build this product with the profit from services, which is certainly what we're doing. But wow, it's really put more burden on us than was necessary. And it has slowed things down, right? Because when you don't have enough to keep the product engines up and running, then things get slower than you wish they were. The biggest challenge I have that's like suddenly becoming a product developing CEO, which is not to say we didn't try. When I was leading the organization I led before this one, we were working on teacher facing product into which we poured an enormous amount of money and made incredible progress and learned so much. And the research was incredible, but like just didn't know anything about what it actually looks like to like make a thing out of nothing or make a thing out of ideas, like make a thing that ends up in people's hands or on people's desktops. And so I knew enough about how much time and money you can spend without actually making a thing that I knew I wanted to be more pragmatic and more careful in that way. And I have a dear friend whose name is Shalini Sharma, who founded and leads an organization called Zern, which is one of the most successful teacher and student facing, mostly student, I should say, facing products in the standards movement in ed reform and education. But Shalini said she never funds any new aspect of her product without asking people to bring her a game board, right? Without asking people to bring her a literal physical object that shows if you do this, then you'll go here. Then like literally like Monopoly, like going around.
I
And
love
Chutes and
that.
Ladders more than Monopoly probably. And that was the first time I was like, oh, I have to like understand all the things. I have to understand all the pages and all the buttons. I like have to care about this level of detail, which has not been my forte. And I have learned and relearned that over and over again. And I will say probably the biggest mistake I continue to make, and I think might have made for the last time, but we'll find out, is underestimating the necessity of my proximity to that game board in whatever form it's in, right? And believing in my own, sort of leaning into my own discomfort or phobia or lack of confidence or lack of experience. And you know, I tend to surround myself with really brilliant people. I just end up being lucky enough to know people like you, Elijah. You know, like anybody that's working on this or has worked on this has been so unusually visionary and skilled, right? And so I tend to just like lean back and like trust the people that are assembled to do this. And as a leader, you have to remember that you do have something to offer here, even if you're not a quote product person. You are the person who can see the thing in your mind's eye, right? And so that means you have to stay, even while you're selling and providing services that exist in, as you say, an incredibly sacred space and require their own skill and attention and energy. Like in order to have this product manifest into real life and then potentially be a place to house these experiences, right? Be a place into which this services work can then journey and land and live and thrive and grow and change and evolve. That product, that foundation, that sort of home has to be built. And I consistently make the mistake of thinking it's going as well as I imagine, and then looking away and then looking back and finding that no, it's not where I thought it would be, and it's not as good as it could be, and you know, all of these things. So I have made the decision recently to not, I haven't told you this yet, to not have a product manager, but rather to force myself to be a project manager, which anyone who's ever worked for me anywhere is like, oh dear, that's a risk. But I don't know how else to force my own hand to stay as incredibly present in the details of this as I can and guide it now finally through that. We're in the sort of early stages still of a build, and really just stay present in the week to week progress of that build, which I think should be over in about 6 weeks. But we're there. We're like finally at the
Congratulations.
gate. I understand the gate. I understand the road between here and a fully developed MVP, and know what the MVP is and what I'm hoping it will teach us and what I'm hoping we can ask it, and then just continue from there. So I'm really excited about it. It is one of the most simple things. So I've spent a lot of time and money, about $40 million, probably $50 million in the end, making curriculum that ended up being really popular and useful curriculum. But curriculum, you decide with a vendor that you're going to make this thing. Nobody has any idea what you actually mean. I mean, we had an RFP that had 87 drafts. So we had like a list of stuff that people had to make. But product is so clean and so honest. And so like, do you like all these screens? Because if you don't, you should tell us now. Because this is what you're paying for, this list of screens, period. Just period. And it's not even like a quality question. It's like, is the quality written down for you as you're looking at it here? If not, you know, say your piece because we're going. And that's so tidy, you know, that's so honest and like simple, even though it's a very complex thing. it's all been written down. So I'm learning that. That's like a nice, the Virgo in me is happy about the tidiness of the actual build.
How long ago did you make the decision to step into that product manager role?
About a month ago.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
incredible.
I know.
I
And then we had to, and then like there were a bunch of stuff that like we had wanted to do that like hadn't been communicated to the dev shop. And so, it's shortly after making that decision, we were like, oh yeah, no, those lists of screens aren't the lists of screens. So we were, we were doing this like new product team thing, which is like, can we just redo the whole thing over again before we build anything? And they've been patient with us. And I think we're done with that arc and are now ready to really move forward. But yeah, if there's people between you and the people making the thing, when you really look at it, it's not
totally,
going to be what you want.
totally. I think that CEOs are or founders are the best first product managers. That's my
It's not the first
belief.
time you've said that to me.
Because there's no substitute for
Right.
what the founder or co-founder is and what that means, the vision holder. And how do you, the product is essentially, and particularly for somebody like you that has years and, in my opinion, lifetimes of wisdom and expertise and skill, it's important to have that close proximity to know to see how that translates, right? Because the product's really a translation. It's a
Yeah.
translation of the expertise. It's a translation of the experience of what
Mm-hmm.
you've witnessed and what your team's witnessed, and how does that translate into a tool that can be used by people and that can scale its impact. So that's an
Yeah.
incredible move, and I'm curious to know how you're balancing, because it's one thing to PM a product alone. It's
Yes.
another thing to PM a product and also have a company that's already running and existing and servicing clients and growing and scaling already. And I'm curious how that balance feels for you in your life currently.
It only works if I'm doing something poorly each day. Sometimes lately, that's the thing that I'm doing poorly is taking care of my body or spirit. But most days, I will say it's one or the other that I'm doing poorly. And I just kind of have to tolerate that. What I'm not doing is living the old way. I'm not only working except for 6 hours or 4 hours of parenting, right? Like I'm not only doing this, right? Like this doesn't keep going with the kind of clarity and groundedness it is if I don't stay whole. So mostly the answer is doing one or the other poorly each day and tolerating that.
Mm. And then, speaking of energy balancing, we think about a lot about the way that energy flows through organizations, right? And energy can be utilized from people, and capital is energy, right? Green energy that comes into the organization. And one thing that you mentioned was you raised this venture capital, and then you have been supporting the rest of the product development work with the services work. And you made some mention of the capital that you raised, and I think maybe you were alluding to that might not have been enough for what you need, but I'm just curious to go back to that, put a pin in that, and see what you were alluding to there, based on what you raised and based on where you're standing right now,
Mm-hmm.
funding this through your services.
Mm-hmm. It's
What does that
exhausting,
feel
but
like? And yeah.
one of my mentors says to me all the time, equity is expensive. And because we are rooted in this idea of decolonizing wealth and have really kind of split the equity of the company amongst the founders, we to give away any more would have been silly and sort of made the thing not ours. And that ownership and that control and power feels incredibly important to us. So yeah, it'd be much easier if we would just go ahead and raise a bunch of money, which I think we will once we have a proof of concept with the product. But in the meantime, the way one of my friend and our investor, Roland Fryer, talks about it is that I've put far more of a burden on us than necessary, than normal. But that independence and that sort of freedom of movement and freedom to prioritize us and wholeness and community and the quality of what we're delivering, and quite frankly just tolerating the amount of time it's taking because of how much we're learning. I mean, the things I could say to you about the work that I couldn't say to you a year ago is a lot. And so the overnight magic of product development is not necessarily always for good. So we'll get there when we're supposed to get there, I think, is what's started to happen as we think about it.
Yeah, it's a journey, and luckily, I mean, you have this running business, this services business that is fueling not only the capital, but it's also fueling the insight, and you're perpetually engaging in market research every single time you engage with clients and injecting that into the work. And so within that, I can see some clear benefits of this model that you have. And it's all moving in divine alignment and divine timing. And I would
Yes.
like to talk a little
Yes.
bit about the product itself.
Okay.
Yeah, I would love to talk a little bit about the product itself, because one of the things that, going back to when you were explaining Rethink and what it's solving for and why it exists, one of the things that we've spoken about is, how within organizations there is the issue of employee engagement and retention. There's the issue of employee wellness and well-being. And then there's all this stuff around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And traditionally within organizations, those are seen within silos, those are seen independently. And I think Rethink really hits on the interconnectedness and the interdependence of those three elements. And I think that what we've seen in the market, I feel like what we've seen with things like Headspace or things like Calm are really scratching the surface. I mean, we call those mindfulness apps, but I think they're really just scratching the surface of what it looks like to have digital tools that actually acknowledge spirit and actually acknowledge the existence of divinity and acknowledge the existence of emotion. And right now in the workspace, there's no space for emotion. There's no space for spirituality. There's no space for actually acknowledging our human essence and our human being. And I think that the product vision really kind of taps into this space. And I would love to bring that down to the MVP proof of concept that you're currently building, and would love to just hear you give us an understanding of what the MVP is and how it's going to be used inside of workspaces.
So with work happiness, a lot of the way we're finding out now what's going on with a team or with a group of people or a subgroup of people, if you will, is to give an engagement survey and to say, who's mad, who's sad, who likes it here, who doesn't like it here. And the consequence of these surveys and the sort of early work that's been done around, quote, inclusion, it's just to name who's sad and who's mad, and to assign blame. Like, well, if most of the people on that manager's team are sad and mad, that means he's an asshole and should go, right? Or like we got to counsel him out, or we have to kind of isolate him and start to move him out or shrink his power or his team. And that is grounded in nothing. That is grounded in no information or not even any belief or value system about what he or she as a manager should be able to do. And so one of the key problems here is that everyone's diversified a bit. I wouldn't say C-suites generally are diverse, but certainly leadership in most corporate centers has diversified some. So you have this newly not entirely hegemonic workforce in management roles and leadership roles, but you have not changed the culture at all. You have not shifted mindfulness. You have not shifted the relationship between each person and their source or their God. You have not centered these relationships. You have not centered relationship between a manager and the person they're managing, or even a team as a whole, right? And so these are human endeavors. These are communities of humans who are spending an awful lot of time together on something that is going to affect other people, right? So what would it take? What would it look like to have all corporate efforts, all capitalist efforts? Some would say this is sort of contraindicated for wholeness, but what would it look like to have all efforts be grounded in my humanity and the humanity of people at the table with me? And so what we've gone and done is defined, we're educators, right? So we've been working around student proficiency for 25 years. Oh, it's been happening for quite a bit longer. That's how long most of us have been in it. And so we've come up naming student proficiency, and we've come up naming the problem in schools vis-a-vis race and other lines of difference and oppression as a student's proximity to proficiency, and what needs to be done if it is a simple math problem of this is what is known and held by this person, and this is what needs to be developed in this person in order for him to be ready for college or ready for the life he imagines. And so we took that same idea and said, okay, what does it look like to define proficiency in managers vis-a-vis belonging? What does it look like to say, this guy can cause a sense of belonging on his team? And so we defined that, but what does it feel like to belong on my team? And we think there's three things. One is genuine concern. I feel like the people around here really care about me, my life, and my values. I exist, I matter here. People see me and they know who I actually am and they like me. Active belonging is this idea that I have a substantive role. I make real contributions that I'm proud of for a team that is coherent and functional. I have meaningful work, right? Virginia Woolf called it meaningful work, right? Like I have substantive contributions that are valuable to a team that I understand and believe in. And then the third thing is professional agency. I know who I am now, and I actually have an idea of who I might become. I know the choices that are ahead of me, but I feel like all of these choices are within my reach, and I understand the progression of what it would take to get from here to there, and I feel like I have support to do so. So those three things: genuine concern, active belonging, professional agency. And so we've defined these things. We figure out how to ask the people who work with you, Elijah, like anyone who sort of touches you or interacts with you as a leader, what is their experience of being a part of that, right? Vis-a-vis genuine concern, active belonging, and professional agency. And people are giving, so I should also say, before we ask anyone these questions, we are, as you say, grounding them. We are creating sacred space. We're using Gina Breedlove's voice as a sound healer who has been doing sound healing and race healing for 30 years, right? And so really grounding and rooting everyone in that sort of, depending on where I am today, how I'm answering in terms of like, what's my mood or what's my sort of moment, situation, she's using different tones to help folks get grounded from wherever they are. And from that grounded space saying, what am I experiencing here around these three questions, around these three domains? And being able to give feedback that, again, is not targeted at blaming or destroying anyone, but is targeted at naming my current experience and knowing who has the power in this person's experience, being able to say, okay, this person needs development or needs to move or grow in these parts of this ability. And then setting up a situation where that's the MVP. And then we'd be in a position to say, here are interventions that we'd recommend, because we know so much about healing, development, and change. We can sort of help you move each of your managers from there. And what is likely true is that a significant set of managers have the same developmental tasks and can be sort of united in that growth journey, in that change process.
And is that the interventions, are those initially for the MVP going to be Rethink's services, like human services, or is that going to be facilitated by the app itself?
Yep, they are. They will initially be offerings that we can provide that would sort of align with and coordinate with this sort of named problem. And then ultimately, the idea is to be in a position where, even though it's a corporate endeavor that has corporate metrics around sort of the developmental curve of each group of managers, right, and can be looked at from either position, it's actually an incredibly uniquely personalized experience so that I become a better manager. I contribute to a healthier whole based on my personal needs and preferences even.
Right. Yeah, I just want to give some flowers for the transition to product and this strategic like use of the services inside of the product and having the MVP serve a very particular purpose. And then how does that actually funnel and how does that build off of what we are currently doing and what we're currently offering? And I'm really excited for the product that's being built. I'm really excited to see what the initial feedback is with these first companies. And one of the things for this podcast and for this community that we really emphasize is that our audience, historically and typically our audience are creators. They're designers, they're entrepreneurs, they're techies, they're folks that are actually out doing stuff and looking for inspiration and looking for cool projects and products to support. And so one of the questions I have for you on this front is, if any, what collaboration or talent are you currently looking for or can currently be of use to what Rethinc is doing and the mission that it has and is driving?
Well, theoretically, if I at this point more or less know what I'm doing and understand the timeline, we're going to need to build a product team in 23. So all the positions, we talk a lot in this organization about how each of us holds our position, and so it's not just like the technical skill that you bring, but also sort of what really honestly spiritual space you occupy in this team, right? And so like how can the contributions of a team of engineers, an actual product manager, right, someone who's leading design, which I mean we have an amazing designer who's leading this work now who I would hope would stay on in more significant capacity. But yeah, the product team overall, we're going to need a chief technology officer. We're going to need someone to really lead this work with far more technical expertise than I have, but someone who is a match for what we're trying to do energetically, right? And can come in and understand the difference between a corporate, a competitive tech offering in sort of HR SaaS, if you will, right? Which I understand all those words, but that's not what we're doing. I mean, it is, but it's not, right? We're doing something far deeper, and we're trying to get to the heart of like a very awful human problem, which is the unbelievable inequity of how capitalism interfaces with differences in us, and really trying to undo that while making space for people to make their own wealth, to make their own families whole and then some, right? Like to participate in this economy, which I understand is sort of facing its challenges at the moment, but will continue to grow overall, right? In the end, we'll continue to grow and thrive. And like, who gets a seat at that table? Who gets to remake that table? Who gets to participate here? And what does that look like racially? What does that look like in terms of gender or neurodivergence, right? What does that look like in terms of sexuality or other sort of identity markers? Like, let's rewrite this. Let's figure out who gets to decide, and let's figure out the sort of the shifting role of whiteness in all of this. How can whiteness then sort of be healed, if you will, by a group of diverse, actually communal, collective of wildly skilled professionals? So
So
that's who
there
we're
we
looking
go.
for.
The call is out. I mean, what I heard there is heart-centered product leaders, product
Yes.
team, product
Yeah.
experts that can come in and contribute to this mission, contribute to this vision, and actually have some personal journeys that are rooted in the work that Rethink is doing. So,
Yeah.
if that sounds like you, the last question I have for you, Kate, is what is the best way for people to find the work that you're doing and the best way for people to find you, support you? And this could be for these heart centered product folks. This could also be perhaps for organizations that want to engage with Rethink.
Yeah. I mean, the easiest way to find us is rethinc.us. So rethinc.us. And my email is Kate Gerson at rethinc.us. We also have that same username on Instagram. Twitter, I just have not been talking on Twitter for some time now, and
But
I'm
you've
not
got
sure.
quite the following on
I
Twitter,
know,
though.
but I
Your,
just
your
like,
Twitter, you got a pretty good
I know,
following
but
on there for
Twitter
sure.
wears me out. Like, Twitter's not that kind. A friend of mine told me that bird Twitter is really kind, so I'm wondering about getting involved in that. But no, I need kind spaces, you know. So perhaps we can recreate Twitter and make it a kinder place together. But for now, most of our interaction is on Insta and in direct work. But yeah, we would love to partner with you if this is the kind of thinking or way of being that you're seeking or have already landed in.
Lovely. I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, Kate. It's been a blessing and an honor to have you on the podcast. I'm so grateful to know you, so
Mm.
grateful to have this friendship and this connection. And I'm so excited to continue to be a part of your journey and be a part of the Rethink journey. And so thank you for being who you are, and thank you for all of the work that you've done and are currently doing.
And I should thank you. You are a great blessing in my own personal life and in the life of this work. It's very good to know
Mm,
you.
mm.